study was to take the 6th and 7th head and what is happening between Panium and Sunday Law and try to understand how this transition takes place and what the 7th head looks like. And one of the reasons that I want us to look at that is because as we went through Acts 27, we identified how Sunday Law could represent a close of probation. And when we take Sunday Law as a close of probation, we can place it then over Raphia. And what do we say happens at Raphia? Yes, this is also a close of probation. But when we start overlaying histories, particularly when we look at the revolutions, we start placing dictators. We go from Kaiser Wilhelm.
He wanted to speech. No.
Napoleon. We start placing dictators down here. Who else?
So are you placing those either side of 2019 or are you just placing them generally there?
Either side.
Okay. So like
November
Napoleon's
8th.
on the right side, Kaiser Wilhelm's on the left.
Yes, because we see it at that period in the revolution, Kaiser Wilhelm dies. It's his end.
So you're showing the transition.
Yes, and we would place Napoleon rising up on November 9. So we see both the death and the rising up of a dictator. At this way on.
Kaiser, please, Kaiser.
Does Wilhelm die on the 8th of November?
Sorry?
Does Wilhelm die on the 9th of November or 8th of November?
He abdicates on the 9th.
He abdicates.
So it's either their death or they step down. So we can place the fall of a dictator, but also the rising up of a dictator. And if we bring this concept, this close of probation that's Raphia, to the close of probation that is Sunday Law, we're seeing the same thing. And what we're identifying is that November 8 is Donald Trump, but November 10 is Donald Trump. That both of these different dictators, whether it's Kaiser Wilhelm or Napoleon, they're all the one person. So it's Donald Trump in this history as a dictator and in this history as a dictator.
But is there any difference between them? Because you know you're marking it before and after. Is there any sort of difference in the way they did things, or?
Why do we mark Napoleon rising up on November 9 at Raphia? Because we've said before we ever understood revolutions, we said Napoleon stood up at Raphia. Why would we say that Napoleon comes at Raphia when Donald Trump was elected in 2016?
Be change in operation. I think that's the best way to put it.
Change in operation? So it's different phases of the one person?
Yeah.
So if we brought that same concept to Sunday Law, and we saw 6 and 7 heads, what are we saying?
Change in operation.
Of what?
6th head.
The same kingdom, the same country. This is Donald Trump all the way through, and that is the United States all the way through, but it's in different phases of its life cycle.
But like when you say Xerxes and Alexander in Daniel 11, we say it's the same person, but it's just showing something different about how they're doing things. I don't know if that's the best way to put it.
So yesterday, I think we agreed in 2016 you could mark the Republican horn falling with the defeat of Hillary Clinton. And then you have Donald Trump, and I would suggest the moment he's elected, he's a dictator. But we tend to mark the dictator in 2019. Kaiser Wilhelm was a dictator. Napoleon was a dictator. The United States heads the UN before Sunday Law, and then it heads the UN after Sunday Law. So what's the difference? What's changing?
With resistance.
Less resistance?
More power.
So could you say there's less and less restraint? So we see before and after the close of probation, it's all talking about the one person, but it's stages of his life cycle. So Donald Trump before 2019, really you could put 2018 in here. What happened on December 19? If you follow his mode of operation before December 19 and after December 19, he's become much less restrained. Part of that was the process of losing his generals and his advisors. Now his policies are exactly what he's spoken of from the beginning, but was not yet able to implement for the first 2 years of his presidency. It's a lot of blank faces.
Sorry, was that a question?
It can be.
So could you repeat what you said?
We can bring Sunday law and place it as a close of probation. If it's a close of probation, we get to raffia. We mark raffia as a close of probation. So it's the same pattern. Sunday law is a close of probation. So we can take all of that down and say that between midnight cry and a close of probation, there's an overturning. And what you have at the end of that process is both something different and the same thing. The United States is overturned between a midnight cry and a close of probation. And then we see the United States after. It's still there, but it's like a new phase of its life. Because we say the United States ended, but it has more power than it did before. A new phase of its life cycle. And that's being illustrated by 6 and 7 heads, by the death and rising up of dictators. All these different stories are to show us the different life cycles, but it's the United States all the way through, and it's Donald Trump all the way through from 2016. Okay. So that was one of the purposes, to go to, when we get to Sunday law, we see that we can say Paddyum to Sunday law, but we could say, just as well say it's between a midnight cry and a close of probation. And if we use that model, between midnight cry and close of probation, you have a change occurring. And we discussed what that change looked like, that you have this overturning of the government or the 6th head, and what is rising up is something different, the 7th head. But when we break it down, it's the exact same country. The United States is the 6th and it is the 7th. But it wields more power as the 7th because it's become a dictator. The dictator is the 6th, it's the dictator is the 7th, but it's marking stages in its life cycle where it's becoming less and less restrained. It's becoming less restrained in that history because you see the fall of the King of the South, and now it's the world's only superpower.
So, remember in the previous session we were talking about how the USA want to interfere with Venezuela, but Russia interferes and stops that happening. So, after the Sunday law, we're going to be marking the Sunday law. How it's going to look like, it's going to be like the USA is telling all the other countries what to do. Like the USA will tell Venezuela after Sunday law.
Right now, when the United States wants those countries to follow it, why are they so bold to resist? If there was no Russia, the Syrian civil war would have ended years ago, soon after it began. But right now, behind those little, weak countries that have nowhere near the firepower the United States has, there's a big Russian bear that's propping them up, giving them courage. They can be bold, because if the United States tries to attack them at the UN, Russia will just veto it, which is what they've been doing all the way along. If the United States tries to pass a resolution against one of the countries that's in Russia's orbit, Russia just vetoes that resolution. So those little countries can hide behind the Russian bear.
So those are the little countries bordered by the bigger countries. Let's say, like Germany, for example. Let's say USA wants Germany to do something. Do you think that in that model would they have enough power to single-handedly do it?
Would Germany have enough power?
Would the USA have enough power to do it?
Once the Russia falls, I think the United States goes back to the same condition it was rising up after 1989. And that is as the world's only superpower. I don't think Germany would be able to withstand. But I'm also aware that some of those countries have their own populist leaders that are allied to Donald Trump. I don't think every country is taken by just fear. Once Donald Trump wants something passed, Brazil at the very least, the biggest country in South America, will just follow. Not everyone's going to be forced. And we were discussing what force looked like. And like Sister Daisy was saying, force can look like, I'm not sending you any more aid. I'm not going to prop up NATO anymore. I'm not going to send missiles into Eastern Europe to protect you. Because all those countries really end up depending on the United States. So that was kind of the purpose, to get to discussing this Sea of Cilicia and Pamphylia between Midnight Cry and Pallium and Sunday Law, or Midnight Cry and Close of Probation. And that also becomes relevant when we bring that internally, and we see that between Midnight Cry 2018 and Close of Probation, Raffia, we see this overturning. And a new type of leadership steps up. This is Donald Trump, this is Donald Trump. This is the United States, this is the United States, but it's in a different stage of its life cycle. And I think these stories are just parables to illustrate what that looks like. But we can bring that onto the internal, and we can say that between Midnight Cry and Sunday Law, in the movement, there's a change in leadership. And we already spoke of that yesterday. There's a change in leadership. So,
And more power, hopefully. No, like Trump gets more and more unrestrained.
yeah,
Increasing.
I think it becomes visible. When we come down to the second line, if we were to do the second line of the ship of Alexandria, where does it begin? Where does the second line of the ship begin?
Let's see.
Just the waymark. We can just draw it with waymarks.
This, oh, the way on.
Not really. Let's see.
It's the ship of Alexandria. Paul gets on it at Myra. But where does the ship begin?
Do you mean
I'm happy for you to just give me the waymarks without the names.
Sunday Law?
1798. Begins at Alexandria. 1798. I was hoping to not have to go through and prove that, just reach some conclusions. It begins in 1798 and it ends at shipwreck. And what does this ship represent? It's a good ship, the ship of Alexandria. This is the bad ship. What does the ship of Alexandria represent?
The movement.
Okay, maybe we can't go here yet. Maybe we stick to our other model. So we talked about Sunday law. Are you all comfortable with that? Before Sunday law, after Sunday law? What does it look like? It looks like the United States before, the United States after. But it wields more power. And now it rules as a dictator. The reason that it has that power is not because there's some type of conspiracy with liberal globalists in the UN. It's because, just like in 1989, that last dominant superpower fell, which was the Soviet Union. And now you have the rise of the world's lone superpower. Between Panion and Sunday law, you have the rise of the world's lone superpower. And no one else in the United Nations can withstand it.
So did you say it rules as a dictator at Sunday law?
Yes.
Oh.
But we can see a dictatorship in 2016, restrained. 2018, less restrained. 2019, less restrained. I think what those parables are trying to do is illustrate those different phases of its life cycle. Any other thoughts or questions? So the ship of Alexandria, if we just approach it, it's named after Alexander, and the name Alexander means defender of the people or protector of men. I'm just going to say it's defender of the people. Defends the people. And we said it began in 1798. We can't establish that without going through each one of its waymarks. Particularly as we look at this first line, we come to Myra and Lycia, and we see that Myra and Lycia means harvest time. It also means bitterness or a bitter experience. So when did Adventism have a bitter experience? And we made Myra and Lycia. In the first line, it's Sunday law. But when we bring that down to the ship of Alexandria, we made that October 22, 1844. Perhaps if we just apply a couple of other of our waymarks. If we went to Acts 27. If we were to turn to verse 13 and 14, if we read verse 13 and 14.
And when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence they sailed close by Crete. But not long after there arose against it a tempestuous wind, called Euroclydon.
So if we were to go look at that verse as a waymark, this wind, where would you place it? This is Euroclydon. Euroclydon means the east wind. Where would you place that? 9/11. So we can place the east wind at the Euroclydon. And what does it say happened just before Euroclydon?
The south wind blew.
They have the south wind. And was this a good south wind or a bad south wind?
It emphasises softly.
For the ship.
But it was soft.
Sound like a good.
So the south wind is blowing softly. But when they see the south wind, they realise they have obtained their purpose. What does that mean?
Got to where they wanted to go. Or in the right direction, or...
It's the wind they need to set sail. So a south wind is exactly what they need, what they're waiting for, to launch them on their journey. They need a south wind to take them to their destination. They want to go to Phoenice. And to get to Phoenice, they need a south wind. So when the south wind starts blowing, they set sail. And they set sail from Lycia, from the Fair Haven, which is close by Lycia. And Lycia means wise or solid, sturdy, thick. Particularly in the concept of wise. So you have Lycia, which means wise, then they have a favourable south wind that begins to blow, that launches them on their journey before they hit an east wind. What do you want to mark this way, Marcos? Where does this... 1989. In 1989, what wind is blowing? The south wind. What's the south wind?
How is it blowing? Is it Russia?
USSR or Russia.
How do you understand the south wind? Because there's more than one wind. There's 4 winds in Bible prophecy.
We know the east wind, we applied that to Islam, and that was a restraint or a distraction. So, could it be with the south wind? Could it be a type of distraction?
Does a wind have to be destructive?
Distraction, sorry.
Distraction?
Yeah.
Yes, and then 9/11, this east wind distracted.
The armies of Rome.
But does a wind have to be negative?
No.
No, when you're saying distract, it's like in a positive thing.
Positive for who?
Lots of people.
Does it have to be positive for us? Is the fall of the Soviet Union positive for God's people?
It depends.
I thought the role of the King of the South was to restrain the King of the North. So is the fall of the Soviet Union positive for us? Because this, if we just see that this is a ship, it's a ship that set sailing from Alexandria. Can't draw. Is the ship that's sailing all through this history, the east wind, is it good for the ship or bad for the ship? Is the south wind good for the ship or bad for the ship?
Good. Good.
It's good. So whatever is happening with the south in this history is good for the ship. Whatever is happening with the east wind at 9/11 is bad for the ship. So I'm not sure if winds, well I am sure, winds I think can be good and bad. Just depends whether or not they're the one you want to blow, because the ship can't sail if there's no wind. No wind is bad.
I don't understand how the east wind would be bad for God's people. If that ship's representing God's people, why would the east wind be bad?
Let the south wind be good.
I get why it's bad in 1989, because, as you said, if the King of the South is going down and the King of the South's role is to restrain the King of the North, that basically is bad for God's people because the King of the North is gaining power. But I would have thought 9/11 would have been good for God's people, because that's our empowerment.
Then what are we making the ship?
What do you mean?
What do you want to say the ship is or represents?
United States.
United States? So you're saying it represents the same as the bad ship?
In terms of what was good and bad for it. With the wings.
But that wind is good, the south and the east is good or bad for the ship. So just going on that, what do you think the ship is?
So the south wind was good
Good for the
and
ship.
the east wind was bad.
Yeah, for the US.
So if we say the ship is the USA,
First time, 1798.
can you say that louder?
So because it started in 1798.
What else started in 1798?
USA.
The Millerite movement.
I like your word better.
What, Adventism?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this ship, the ship of Adramyttium, represents the United States and Adventism. And this ship, the ship of Alexandria, represents the United States and Adventism. And we can see that in a story, but we can also tell that just by compare and contrast. If this ship represents the United States and Adventism, this ship has to represent the United States and Adventism. It can't just represent the United States. Are we okay with that?
So you're saying it represents it?
So are we saying this ship in verse, is it in verse 13 of Acts 27?
It starts in verse 6.
So are we saying that ship is both the USA and Adventism?
Yes.
So when the south wind blows, no, I don't get it.
You don't get what.
So when the south wind blows, it affects both the USA and Adventism.
Yes.
Okay. So is it two different entities, but they're both represented by a ship?
I would suggest yes.
Okay.
Because I think what these lines are trying to tell us is that you can't separate these.
Okay.
These are from 1798, like Brother Tom said. This is the start of the United States. And right from the time of the end, these two are linked and they can't be separated at any way more.
Land of liberty.
So who is the south wind positive for and who's it negative for? Or is it both positive or negative for both the USA and Adventism?
I think it's positive. But it also has a negative sense because Paul says this is going to end badly. Because Ellen White says if the south wind is blowing, you might think it's good, but it's just the predecessor of the east wind. She says that in this part of the Mediterranean, the south wind precedes the east wind. So if you see the south wind blowing, you know the east wind is coming. They should have known that.
Mm.
Sorry, so what we're defining as the south wind?
8th of July.
What do you want to say the south wind is?
I assume it's some kind of power. The east wind is represented as Islam.
We have 4 winds in Bible prophecy. What would the south wind be linked to?
Not sure.
The east wind is the east. What's the south wind?
In the south.
Russia.
In the south. Okay.
That's right. So. And Ellen White says before the east wind comes the south wind. So if the south wind is blowing, you know that the east wind is approaching. Which is why the south wind shouldn't have been good news, because they should have known that what was coming next was the east wind.
So what was coming next was Islam.
Yes.
So,
You're saying it's good news in what they wanted at that time, but it's like an omen of what's coming.
Yes, exactly. So when we come into our time, when we see the south wind blows, what do we know is coming?
East wind. So
Unexpectedly and with explosives.
So could we apply that in the middle at time when so we had the south wind in 1798 and the east wind coming in August 11th, 1840.
Yeah.
what would that south wind look like at 1798 in relation to the USA?
Or the King of the North. Because isn't that when the King of the South pushes at the King of the North?
Yeah. In that stage it's not negative, I think it's not positive. I don't think the fact that the south precedes the east wind is connected to positive or negative, because it entirely depends on what direction you want to travel.
But isn't that good for Adventism, because don't we say that we know obviously the King of the North was persecuting God's people and the earth swallowed up the flood. So obviously once the King of the South pushed at the King of the North and obviously King of the North goes down, it gives God's people, it's like it's all tied into the rise of Adventism in America.
How I've heard it taught is that the persecution had to go for 1260 years all the way till 1798. And the fact that the papacy stops in 1773 means that another power had to complete the 25 years, and that was France. In that way, I would see it as negative, that they were another persecuting power.
But if we're talking about
Don't took on the word vigorously.
the ship of Alexandria, we're talking about it in terms of 1798, although the King of the South is doing a different way to what happened in 1989, can't we still see it as positive for the United States? Because it allows the United States now to come, Revelation 13 is when the papacy goes down, that's when the United States comes up. And the United States was set up to try and, to have principles opposite to what was going on in Europe. And so the downfall of papal system, if you want to call it that, gives it more liberty, like less threat to its existence as a nation. So, although it's doing a different work, it can still be seen as positive in 1798.
Yeah.
Because we're not coming at it as at the angle of the King of the North per se yet. Then, because remember they also changed rules. They're coming from escaping the papacy back then, and now the working is the opposite way.
Yeah, I think so. Adelia.
So, back to the Millerite history. So, the South wind blew in 1798, and then the Millerites knew the day and hour for the East wind. Josiah Litch, he gave the prediction then 10 days before the event happened. So, if you apply that in our time, we should have known. Could you say we should have known the day and hour for 9/11?
I think in retrospect it gets easier, but yeah, I think it just continues to be defended by prophecy that Islam had to strike.
Or can you put up an argument and say, okay, because now we know that the south wind is, blowing now, we should have the day and hour for the next event, or Islam, or whenever.
The 18th of July.
Times open up basically by Josiah Litch, which was a cause and effect from the south wind blowing to the day and hour being opened up. So could you apply some sort of logic for our time to do with the day and hour in the south wind blowing?
That hurts my head at first, saying, but it makes sense to me. So. Does it? Yeah. Maybe you'll break it down for me. I see the concept, but I think I would. I take time to absorb information.
Yeah, maybe later when I have to write it out.
So, are you all happy that the ship of Alexandria also represents the United States and Adventism? Because first comment was that it was a movement.
That makes sense. I'm still not entirely sure or know what the King of the South is at 1798. I'm not sure what it is.
It wasn't my purpose to place the South Wind and East Wind and make it a story about that history. That was kind of a diversion. But I think Elder Paminda's studies at the School of Brazil bring in more light into the King of the South in that history. Okay. Particularly when we start considering the Millerite interpretation and the role of Egypt and Napoleon. I think that could come into the story. So, if we were to just see it as United States and Adventism, we have the same institutions represented by two ships, and one is a ship that chooses to abide in death, that is in a dead condition before 1989 and remains in it. And then we see their story, not from 1989, but now it goes back to 1798.
Is this the same ship which is called the Good Ship?
Yes.
Okay.
So in this history, it's the bad ship. In this history, it's the protector, it's the defender of the people. Because what is the role of the United States?
To defend the people.
It's opened up to protect the people. So, what I hoped we would see from this, or go from this, is to see these two entities, that the United States and Adventism are interconnected from 1798 and then through every waymark, because they're represented by the one entity. that one entity sails the same sea, it goes through all the same waymarks. So 1844 we can see internally, but what happens externally? The first 1798, we have the quotes in Great Controversy where she says that it was in 1798 that the United States was represented as rising up. So Ellen White says the United States rose up in 1798. So we can place both America and Adventism at the one-way mark. But what about 1844?
So what was your question about 1844?
How do we place both entities in 1844? United States and Adventism.
Yeah, Adventism is a bit obvious.
Okay. Externally, United States. We get the internal.
I don't know, I can just... I know when it talks about the second angel's message being applied to the church of the United States and this land which has received so much light. And she says Babylon is fallen applies to... She says churches of the United States, but I don't know if you can apply that wider to the whole land, because you can't separate the land and the people.
If we were to go to... I won't read it for time, I'll just refer you to Great Controversy, it's chapter 21. Particularly from 376, paragraph 1. And it speaks about 1844. And she quotes a lot of different sources, particularly different Protestant ministers. And she says that in 1844 a marked change was apparent in most of the churches through the United States. In that year there are evidences of a sudden and marked declension in nearly all the churches of the land. And then she starts quoting people. Mr. Barnes, author of a commentary, said that he had been in ministry for 20 years and never until this period had he seen such a change in the church. No awakening, no conversion, no growth. Professor Finley of Oberlin College says talks about the conditions of the churches. The religious press of the whole land testifies, and they're marking it, what she calls it, a marked declension that they'd never before witnessed in the churches in America. So in 1844, what happens to the lamb-like beast? Why does Antigonus go into 2016 with one eye?
Uses his eye.
Yes. When did he lose that eye or that horn?
1844. 19th.
Are you okay with that? So we can mark United States and Adventism in 1844. Yes.
So, as it was originally understood, the horn was placed as falling or being taken away at April the 19th. So, are we still able to apply it there and almost show it as a progressive fall in its completion at October 22nd? Is that what we're doing here?
When I say we can place them at every waymark, I'm not trying to do all the history of Millerite history, because we know they don't have external events connected. Mm-hmm. But when we mark the course of the ship, if we just saw it as 1844 and Millerite history, I don't think it was a one-off thing. This is the close of probation. I think we can still just see the horn fall in 1844. Sister Daisy can correct us if we're wrong.
What, the Protestant horn?
Yeah.
So
Are you happy to connect that
To 1844?
with connect the United States and Adventism in that history, without saying that it's necessarily just October 22? Do you have thoughts on that? I don't think it has to be on the same
It
day.
doesn't have to be on the same day. Just like when we look at 9/11, the things were attached there, they don't happen at the same time.
And when we
On the
talked
same
about
day.
2018 yesterday, we saw internally the midnight cry was October, the external event was in December. The battle was in December.
But we still place those thing together.
Yes. It's still what we needed to see externally to mark that waymark. Any other thoughts?
So what we're saying internally there, we're marking the rad word, third angel, how we...
If we take that to, that's Myra and Lycia that we were placing in 1844.
Yeah.
That gives us harvest, the white field, and it also gives us bitterness, which was sweet in the mouth, bitter in the belly. And then we come to our next waymark. We will read verse 7. And this was really the purpose. Verse 7. Acts 27, verse 7.
Thank you.
The next waymark they encounter is Cnidus. Would somebody read that?
And when we had sailed slowly many days, and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete, over against Salomon.
So the ship leaves from Alexandria. We mark that as 1798. Then it encounters Myra, which is the bitter experience in 1844. We see that the Protestant horn is broken. And then the next waymark or event that we encounter is it comes up against Cnidus. And what happens here? If you were to look at the map in your Bible, at the journey of the ship, those of you that have Bibles, and if you have maps at the back of Paul's fourth missionary journey, you can mark what happens here, because this impacts the whole of their journey. Brother Rayon,
Yes.
what happens here?
That wind forces them in a contrary direction, I suppose, to where they actually want to go.
So all this history, this ship is just sailing on its path, where it's needed to go, and then at Cnidus, what happens?
They turn, side
They completely go off course.
Yeah.
So they've been on course from Alexandria, and then they get to Cnidus, the winds are contrary, they're not favourable, and they go off course, and they are off course all the way up until the ship is wrecked. They never get back on course. So what happens at this waymark to the United States and to Adventism is that they go off course. From 1798 they've been on course. What do you want to mark Cnidus? Where do they go off course? 1863. We can see that in Adventism. We know in 1863 that's what happened. Is everyone comfortable with Adventism? What about the United States?
Civil War.
Yeah.
So there's a
Glorious land.
civil war in this history. 1863, what does it take us to?
99.
It can take us to 1989. But as a midpoint, when we actually want to consider the history it's in, which is the Civil War, what it takes us to is 2014. This is 1861 to 1865. So we can easily see it from Adventism. We all know that history. In 1863, how they go off course. But what about the United States? What is it about the Civil War?
It divides. State.
I want us to see is that in every one of our waymarks, the United States and Adventism are linked, all the way up to shipwreck, which is Sunday law, and they're both wrecked. But we know Adventism continues through and the United States continues through. But as their institutions, it's their close of probation that they end at Sunday law. But you can't separate them at 9/11 or at 1989. You can't separate them at our waymarks all the way back to 1798. When we get to 1863, we see Adventism goes off course. Then how do we mark the United States going off course? And before we discuss that, what I find particularly interesting is that it never gets back on course. So when we talk about Adventism, we come over into our history and we can see that there is, 1863, they reject the prophetic message, they reject the 25-20. When we come to our history, many people in our churches in Australia have never heard of, or would never, at the very least, would never be able to defend the 2300 if they don't actually reject that as well. Most of them have never heard of the 25-20. So we've come into 4 generations of increasing darkness to where we don't even remember what we were raised up for. And when we consider the United States then, what is its level of darkness? As to what it was meant to be, it has to be equal.
Gross darkness.
The darkness in our history regarding Adventism or what God's people were meant to be is equal to that of the darkness regarding the United States and what it was raised up for. So when Donald Trump says, "Make America great again," in what history does he want to go back to? I can guarantee you it isn't prior to 1863. He's not wanting to go back that far. Where I think he's going back is to the 1850s.
1819.
Sorry?
1819.
1950s. So this is where we're kind of being challenged. Many of us are being challenged in trying to redefine what the United States was meant to be. And part of that work is going back into the writings of A.T. Jones and seeing what he stood for. But there's a couple of things that happened in that Civil War period. First of all, what was set up in 1863 as a result of the Civil War?
Church Day.
So in 1861, the Civil War begins, and what do the ministers say?
It's a judgment from God.
It's judgment of God. Why?
Because of immorality.
Sorry?
Because of immorality. They don't see
So the churches say this is judgment of God because of immorality and because God has not been recognized in the government. Does Ellen White say the Civil War is judgment of God? Why does Ellen White say the Civil War happened?
Slavery.
Was that judgment? She says it's judgment. She says it's God's judgment on the United States because of slavery. So you have 2 different narratives explaining the same history. And we come to 1861 and the churches start to say this is the judgment of God because we have not recognised God in the government, in the constitution, in the courts, in the schools. And then we have Ellen White saying this is judgment of God, but it's because of slavery. And what they did back in 1798 and prior to that history, they wrote a constitution and they didn't include it for everyone. It's kind of like Adventism. You come to this history, you come to 1798, and how much light did Noah have in 1798? Not much. It had to grow. This was just the beginning of a process. They didn't have everything in 1798. So the United States, they had a constitution. Did they really know what it meant? That was meant to grow. Because when it comes to the constitution and what they had set up, it wasn't for black people, it wasn't for women, it was just for a subgroup. They were meant to grow and learn what it meant to be the United States. Does that make sense? I think we can tend to think they had it all figured out, but the Millerites didn't. Adventism didn't have the Sabbath until after 1844. So did the United States have themselves figured out in its history? But what are they doing about it? They're fighting against it. And it comes to this history, and instead of recognising why they are being judged, where their problem lies, they forget their purpose. Adventism forgot their purpose in 1863, which was their prophetic message. The United States forgot their purpose. And instead of recognising why their nation was in trouble, they thought it was the judgment of God because of immorality and that their God was not being recognised by the government. You come down to 9/11, and that same history is being repeated. We see the churches after 9/11 are saying that the Islam striking at 9/11 is the judgment of God because of the immorality and the fact that God is not recognised in the government. That narrative becomes much more forceful after Obama wins the 2012 election because he's brought in gay marriage. And now their argument just gets stronger because now they can point to a law gay marriage and say, look at the immorality. This nation is losing touch with God and God is going to judge us. So they have reasoning behind it, which is the exact same as they had during the Civil War, to say that God needs to be reintroduced to America. And we see those same arguments. We see it when there's school shootings and they say, oh, it's because they don't allow God into the schools. How can God protect the students if he's not allowed into the schools? And A.T. Jones says God should never be allowed into the public schools. They should not have Bible teaching. It's church and state. So we don't only have to go back and realise our prophetic roots and what Adventism was raised up for. I think what's becoming more and more obvious is that we need to reconsider the United States because this history is being repeated. And we need to make sure we don't fall into the same category as the evangelical churches, which are using this narrative to justify Donald Trump. Does that make sense?
What do you think the implication of A.T. Jones saying that God shouldn't be taught in the church is?
In the schools?
In the schools, sorry, yeah.
You're going to have difficulty teaching creationism in a public school without the Bible. And yet that is exactly what A.T. Jones is fighting against. No Bible teaching in public schools. And Ellen White tells him to be careful there because she thinks he'll do damage, but she agrees with his concept. He was strong. There should be no Bible teaching in public schools. He says the only reason you're wanting to do that is because you think you're a Christian nation. He says you have never been a Christian nation. The United States was not a Christian nation in 1798. If they did, they already had church and state. They were never to be a Christian nation. And he says if you want to have the Protestant Bible taught in your schools, then you need to be really comfortable with, in a few years when your numbers go down, if there's if your children go to those schools and are forced to learn Catholic doctrine. And I would say now, if you don't want them to go to school and have to study from the Quran, then don't push a Bible in a school. Which means no 7-day creation week in a public school. It's impossible. Shouldn't be.
It's in line with the Constitution.
Sorry?
It's in line with the Constitution. I mean, like, no... Everyone has freedom of conscience, liberty of conscience.
Yes.
So you're free to choose what you want, but if you teach it in the school, you're forcing it
Yes.
on people. And if you're doing that, then you have to accept whatever the schools teach, whether it's, as you say, whether it's the Sabbath or whether it's Catholicism or spiritualism.
Yeah.
You know, you have to sort of whatever religion they decide.
Yeah.
And the whole point of a republic is different from the democracy. Democracy is like majority rules, so the majority decide is going to be the Quran this year.
Yeah.
But republic is everybody studies for themselves. You study what you want, and that's exactly what was happening in Europe.
And what he says, what A.T. Jones says in this history, is that the Constitution was written to protect minorities, not majorities. What you have in our history is you have the majority feeling hard done by because their country doesn't look like what they want it to look like. And they say we need to protect the Judeo-Christian West because we're the majority. The exact same argument they're making in this history. And A.T. Jones says that's not constitutional. It was right if the Constitution was written to protect minority groups. And you say that down in our history and the Christian West gets offended. So you have 1861 to 65. I want to mention one other thing happening in this history. In 1861, a minister writes to the government. He writes to, I can't remember his name, but he says that we need to actually recognise, that God in the government, and the best way to do this would be to come up with some type of phrase that recognises God. So 1861. They call for a phrase. And this is a pastor. He says we need to recognise it in the government. So the government accepts. He writes to, I think, the head of the bank. I'm going to quickly look it up.
Should we say 10, 15 minutes?
Okay, I'll just finish this point. Reverend Watkinson wrote to the Secretary of State, Salmon Chase, that a religious slogan should be placed on American coins. This had been called for prior to 1861, but it had been resisted because of the First Amendment. So periodically, before the Civil War, religious leaders wanted a religious slogan to be put on coins for purely religious reasons. But they never gained much traction because it was recognising that this would violate the First Amendment of the Constitution, which said, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. But in 1861, because of the Civil War, they're more open to this thought. And the reasoning they're more open is because you have the Republican states wanting to say, with the Republican North wanting to say that God is on our side. So Salmon Chase wrote a letter in 1861 saying that no nation can be strong except in the strength of God or safe except in his defence. And the trust of our people in God should be declared on our national coins. And then it goes to Congress and they begin to debate exactly what phrase they want to introduce into their coins. And they decide that in 1863, the phrase they want to use is, "In God we trust." This was a direct violation of the First Amendment. But the reason they're willing to do this in 1863 is the same reason that in 1863 they set up the National Reform Movement. And the reason they set up this movement is they can see the North, led by Abraham Lincoln, is failing in the Civil War. The Republican states are failing, and they want to show that God is on their side and bring the nation back to God. We bring that to 2014, and now it's the Republican South that is failing in the middle of a civil war because you have Obama, and there's a call to bring the nation back to God. You can parallel those histories. We won't go into it for time. But in 1863, it's not just the National Reform Movement that it's established. They also choose this phrase, "In God we trust." It already existed in a stanza of the American anthem that was ignored. It was never really included as one of the stanzas they would sing. But they came across it, they pulled it out, and they decided it would become the recognised phrase of the United States. And then in 1864, they begin to impress it onto their coins. In 1865, they come up with new coins, and this is where it really takes off. And they include the religious phrase on their coins. So should "In God We Trust" be on American currency?
No.
No, it's a violation of
Church
church and
state.
state, but it only came about because of the Civil War. If we were to go into the 1950s, you see that exact same pattern repeated, except now it isn't "In God We Trust." Now what they introduce, because they're in a Cold War, there's an atheistic power they're fighting, and they're saying we need to recognise God in our government to set us apart. And what they do is they create, they change the Pledge of Allegiance to one nation under God. Those words "under God" never existed before the 1950s. So when we look at the United States and what it was meant to be, it's been off course since 1863. All of these things that we take for granted, you know, these phrases "under God," "In God We Trust," the currencies, it was never designed that way that it should be that way.
Give unto Caesar that which Caesar's.
And in 1956, "In God We Trust" became the motto of the United States. Now it's the national motto. What was their national motto before 1956? It was a Latin phrase that said "out of many, one." So they recognised many states, one country. It was completely secular. But because of the Cold War in 1956, they changed it to the phrase "In God We Trust." So you can mark other dates in the 1950s and see the same pattern, which we won't do for time. I just wanted us to realise or perhaps see exactly how the United States began to go wrong. And they brought in church and state, particularly because of the Civil War, but we see it repeated in the Cold War. And I'm saying both of these histories are illustrated in the United States after 9/11, particularly after 2014, where you have the Republicans losing in a civil war. Yes.
It's interesting that they go back to this motto of "In God We Trust" in 1956. You know, we're talking about the USA and Adventism together, and the next year in 1957 we had questions on doctrine, which Adventism kind of backtracks on what they were designed to do, just like the USA is backtracking by doing that on what they were designed to do.
Yes. Exactly, and it is in response to a national crisis. 1950s was the Cold War, was a particularly heightened portion of that Cold War. And so there's this national fear and fear of God's judgment, but out of their fear of God's judgment, because they have a completely wrong understanding of God and what He expects of them, they make all the wrong decisions based on that. Just like they did in the Civil War, they completely misinterpreted why their nation was going wrong. Do you have any thoughts or questions? Otherwise I think we'll close and let you go on your way.
I guess on the back of Tom's point, it was out of fear that the SDA Church actually published that book. It's because of the view of them being a cult, you know, from the Protestant or evangelical churches and their.
And they also, they published that book, but when were they studying? When were they studying with the evangelical leaders? That was 1955 and 1956. 1956 is actually when they're completing their studies. 1957 is they just put it into a book. So you can mark that in the year. That's when the decisions are made. And that's internal and external.
There was an interesting documentary someone put together 5 years ago on the founders of the Constitution and that, and the way he did it, it went into each founder's life and that, about 3 hours. He worded it that it was just their way of legalising demon worship. But it also, categorised, it was a safety for God's people as well, but it was just their legal expression of legalising demon worship.
Well, I'm not sure what that was in their time, but if that's freedom of religion, then it's necessary.
Well, it would be.
Because what
for the
freedom
witches
should we
and
give
all the-
people in our history? The same freedom we expect of ourselves, no matter who they were wanting to worship. Yes.
This is a bit controversial. I think when it comes to being legal, I think it should be legal to worship demons if you want.
The
But then
Constitution
it
is
should be legal for you to worship God in the same, like that
Yeah.
freedom, that legality gives the freedom to worship who you want.
I think gay marriage should be legal. If it doesn't hurt you, then why not? Because your reasons are going to be religious. And if you stick to the Constitution like Obama did, why not? We get the wrong perspective when we follow the evangelical way of thinking.
But by
And that's
putting
why they think that there's judgment on the United States and they have to get rid of Obama. If we'll close in a prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for our blessings. Thank you, Lord, that we've had freedom all this time. We recognise that that freedom has been directly planned by you, Lord, that you've sheltered us and protected us, that you had your hand in the authoring of that Constitution that was to provide freedom. And Lord, I pray that through all the noise and through all the misunderstandings and the mess, we might be able to identify your hand and your plan, what you originally intended. May we be willing, Lord, just like A.T. Jones said when he stood in Congress, he was not defending the Saturday Sabbath, but defending the right for every person, Lord, to decide how they would live, how they would worship, that he was defending freedom. And if it was a Saturday Sabbath they were enforcing, he would have fought that too. May we afford other people the freedoms that you give us. I pray where there is unlearning, we will unlearn, and that we might have a greater understanding of your character and what you want, what you wished for your church to be, that we can represent you, particularly when we come up to the time when we are to do public evangelism and take your message to the world, that our old ideas, our conspiracy theories do not come in and hinder that work. I pray, Lord, for your latter rain. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.